Welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, I'm going to be peeling back the layers a little bit here of some human psychology, our sexuality, and our relationships. And I'm going to try to do so today without judgment, without shame. And we're just going to have a real honest conversation about what makes us who we actually are. Today, we're going to be talking about something that weighs heavily on a lot of people, especially on their minds: shame and guilt around our fetishes. Now, for so many, the realization of a kink or a fetish really isn't the problem. It's really what comes after: the fear of judgment, the internalized messages from society, religion, past experiences, partners, family, even our friends, and all that tells us, because then inside we internalize this isn't normal. That something about us, is broken. And when those messages come from people we love, that shame can cut even deeper. But fetishes and kinks are deeply personal to us, yet too often people feel like they have to hide or suppress them to be accepted. Now, whether it's something like power exchange, impact play, cross-dressing, whatever it is that drives you. Anything else that falls outside the mainstream sexuality, the emotional weight of shame and guilt can create real harm for us, both personally and in our relationships. So today, we're going to break this down. I'm going to talk to you about what shame and guilt actually are, how they take hold of us, and why so many people struggle with them when it comes to their sexual identities. Then we're going to dig into why we shouldn't feel ashamed for our desires, because the truth is, there's nothing wrong with wanting what we want. And finally, we're going to go over how to start shedding that guilt and reclaiming our right to our self-acceptance. Now, before I get into all this, I want to take a moment here to thank all of my listeners. I appreciate all of your questions coming in, suggestions for future shows. And for those of you who are starting to tune in for the first time, you all really do make this show what it's about. Those out in their individual communities asking these tougher questions around things we do inside of the lifestyle and how they interact with our emotions and our thinking. So whether you've been here since the beginning or you just found yourself coming to the show for the first time, all of that support, all of your engagement keeps these conversations alive. And if you'd like to support the work I do, there is a donation link in my profile. And that way, you can help me keep covering the things that I want to cover and keep moving the show and these discussions that we're having. And if you would, consider following along, especially if you're just kind of curious, and rating the show. Like on Spotify, you got to rate me on the app. There's a little 3 buttons next to the rate my show. Rate it, hit the 5 stars. This also allows my show to keep growing, keeps me keeping the show free for now. In 4 years, I haven't charged anybody for this. So it really does keep these conversations going and get out to more people who might need to hear these things. All right, so let's get into this today. We need to first understand shame and guilt. And to really understand how shame and guilt shape our experiences, we have to break down these emotions. Now, they're often used interchangeably, but they're actually very different in how they affect us. Guilt here is tied to behavior. It's the feeling that we've done something wrong, and it's action-oriented. You make a mistake, you've crossed a line, or you act in a way that it doesn't align with your values, you feel guilty. But guilt can be constructive. It's our internal guide telling us to make amends, to correct a misstep, to do better next time. It can motivate change and help us stay in alignment with our moral compass. Now, shame, though, that does go deeper. And it's not about something we did, but it's really about who we are. Guilt says to us, I made a mistake. But shame tells us, I am the mistake. And instead of being tied to an action, shame attacks our identity. It makes us believe that at our core, we're unworthy or defective or broken. Now, when it comes to our kinks and our fetishes, shame can be incredibly damaging. Now, many of us grew up absorbing messages about what's considered normal, and especially when it comes to things like sex and desire. We're told directly or even indirectly that there's a right way and a wrong way to experience pleasure. Now, society also has its views and culture and our religions, our families. All of these influences shape our beliefs about sexuality, often without us realizing it. So, when we develop desires that fall outside the narrow definition of what's quote unquote normal, we internalize the idea that something is wrong with us. And that's not just about our desires that are different, but that we're somehow flawed for having them. That's the power of shame. And it makes us believe a lie so deeply that we stop questioning it. For a long time, when I first got into this lifestyle, God, 20 plus years ago, I thought when my first approach when I came to this place was, what's wrong with all of you people? And I was internalizing all the things that I kind of enjoyed that I didn't even realize were a part of it. That I liked certain fetishes. But out of guilt, I didn't really understand how to process all of that. Out of that shame, I thought people would hate me if I discussed it. Right? All of these things that kind of circle around inside of us. But see, here's the thing. Shame isn't an inherent part of us. It's learned. And what we learn can be unlearned. And the more we understand where shame comes from, the more we can start to challenge it. Because the truth is, the existence of a fetish, a kink, or a desire doesn't make someone broken. It just makes you human. And we have to remember that part. We all like different things. We all want to experience different things. From a Pepto-Bismol enema to clipping somebody's toenails while you're holding your breath underwater, to spanking or suspension or anything in between. You're human, and it's normal to have those fantasies, as long as they're healthy and safe, right? Gonna add that caveat in. But when we're looking at shame and guilt, I want to get to the big part of it here, the psychological impact. Now, shame doesn't just sit there quietly, by the way. It really does take root. It settles in deep, and it shapes how we see ourselves, how we move through relationships, and how we experience intimacy. And what's the worst part here? Shame doesn't feel like something external was forced on us. It feels like the truth. And like it's just the way things are. And when you carry shame about your desires, you start to believe this part of you, there's something inside of you that has to be hidden. That if people really knew you, they'd reject you. That you're somehow wrong or unlovable, damaged or perverse. That belief doesn't just sit in the back of your mind. It influences everything. Our confidence, our relationships, our ability to be fully present with our partner, or our ability to even enjoy pleasure at all. And what happens when you start to feel like part of you has to be hidden? You start living in fear. Fear of being judged, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing relationships if the wrong part of you is exposed. And that fear can push people into secrecy, not just from partners, but from themselves. Some try to suppress their desires altogether, telling themselves, if I just ignore it, maybe it'll go away. But it doesn't. It usually amplifies it. Because sexuality doesn't work that way. It doesn't just disappear because we've been taught to feel ashamed of it. It lingers in the background and it builds frustration, resentment, and sometimes even self-hatred. And the longer we deny who we are, the more we distance ourselves from real acceptance, and the harder it becomes to feel whole. Now, shame in the relationships, and the things we start doing that surround it, we start putting up walls. And this really does take a toll here, because when you feel ashamed of your fetish or your kink, it doesn't just affect you. It affects how you connect with somebody else. Shame creates distance. And if you're afraid of being judged, you might avoid talking about your desires. You might shut down conversations before they even start, fearing the reaction you expect from your partner. Or maybe you decide it's safer to keep this part of yourself completely separate from your relationships, engaging in, maybe doing it secretly instead. And guess what? That secrecy, it doesn't just protect you, it isolates you. You're suddenly holding part of yourself back from someone you care about. You're creating a space they can't enter, ever. Not because they don't want to, but because they don't even know it exists. And over time, those emotional walls, they can grow so high that even you struggle to see over the top of them. And this is where we start seeing deeper struggles in intimacy. Maybe you avoid sex altogether because it doesn't feel fulfilling without that, hidden part of you. But maybe you go through these motions, but you feel disconnected. Maybe you start resenting your partner, not because they've done anything wrong, but because you feel trapped in a dynamic where you can't be yourself completely. And what about guilt? That's the other half of this conversation today. When we feel wrong for what we want, guilt's a little different from shame because it's about our behavior. It's about feeling like we've done something wrong. Maybe it's about breaking a promise or hurting someone's feelings or crossing a boundary. In those cases, guilt can be helpful because it becomes a signal that we need to make things right. But when it comes to our kinks and our fetishes, guilt often shows up when it shouldn't. You feel guilty for wanting something that, makes you happy. You feel guilty for exploring your desires even when they're consensual and they don't harm anybody. And sometimes that guilt comes from the people closest to you, partners who don't understand, family members who don't approve, religious or your cultural beliefs that will label anything outside of the norm as deviant or wrong. And that guilt, it really does feed into our shame cycles. You feel ashamed for having the desire. You feel guilty for wanting to express it. You push it down, you try to suppress it, and then it inevitably resurfaces. The shame and the guilt hit even harder this time. And I'm going to tell you, that cycle can be really exhausting. It's going to lead people to self-doubt, avoidance, self-sabotage, all inside of our relationships, even a relationship with ourselves. Some people can withdraw here completely from intimacy because they believe it's easier to be alone than to risk being rejected. Others engage in these desires in a way to feel unhealthy or compulsive, not because their kinks are inherently bad, but because repression can distort expression. So where does this leave us? And how do we break out of this loop? The real first step here is recognizing that liking something isn't wrong. If it's consensual and it brings you happiness and joy, if it doesn't harm anyone, then the problem isn't the kink, it's the shame and guilt around it. And that shame, it's not something you were born with, it's something you learned. And if it was learned, it can be unlearned. And that's where we're going to go next. Why we shouldn't feel shame for our desires and how we start undoing the years of conditioning that made us believe we shouldn't. Now, why we shouldn't feel shame for our desires. Why shouldn't we feel ashamed for our kinks and fetishes? Because you know what? They're a natural part of human sexuality. Desire isn't something we consciously decide. It's something we discover. None of us sat down one day and thought, I think I'll dive or develop a fetish for rope bondage, or I'd like to be turned on by dominance and submission. That's not how attraction works. It emerges. And trying to suppress it, that's like trying to suppress hunger or thirst. It's not going anywhere. The real issue isn't the fetish itself, it's the shame attached to it. And that shame doesn't come from inside you. It comes from the cultural conditioning and outdated moral frameworks and arbitrary social norms, all about what's considered acceptable when it comes to sex and pleasure. And let's put this really into perspective. What's considered taboo now wasn't always taboo. Throughout history, sexuality has been taken on in different forms depending, where we are at in time, our place, and our cultures. In ancient Rome and Greece, same-sex relationships were normalized. That was a Monday afternoon. In the 18th century and 19th centuries, dressing in clothing other than of another gender, it wasn't just accepted. It was fashionable, especially in certain circles. Even BDSM for us, which many people still see as extreme, has existed for centuries and has been practiced in different ways all over the world. It's not just centric, it didn't just spark up with one person, it wasn't just started by one community. And I really do, that's going to be a topic for another day, that we keep saying it comes back to one community long ago after World War II. That's just not true. And I love that community, but it's just not true. Not the point of today, though. The point here is that the way we view sexuality isn't fixed. It changes based on society, and much of what we consider normal today is just a result of modern social conditioning. So if that's the case, why should we let outdated ideas dictate how we feel about our own sexuality? Well, shame has, shame only has the power we let it stay when we let it stay in the dark. The more we talk about our desires, the more we normalize them. And when we normalize them, we take away the power to make us feel isolated and bad about ourselves. Now, think about how many people enjoy kink and BDSM and fetishes far more than most would assume. The internet has definitely made that clear. Entire communities connect there, and they exist for people who share the same interest, and yet so many still believe they're alone. That's because shame tells us to stay quiet, to hide, and to pretend, right? But what happens when we actually speak about it? We realize we aren't alone. That plenty of people share the same fantasies and desires, that we aren't broken or weird. We're just human. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with anything that we do. There's nothing inherently wrong with bondage or domination or being pegged or anything else, dressing like a pup. None of these things. There's nothing wrong with any fetish that exists in the realm of consent. The only thing wrong is the idea that we shouldn't carry the weight of our desires in silence. And that silence, that's where shame thrives. So the question becomes, what happens when we stop feeding it? And that's going to bring me to the next step here. How do we actually start letting go, or how do we actually start letting go of that shame? How do we move from understanding to action? And I'm going to talk about that here next. And this is, how do we overcome shame and guilt? So how do we start moving past all of this? That's a good question. Because recognizing the problem is one thing, but breaking free from it's another. The good news here, shame and guilt aren't permanent. They feel ingrained, but they're learned responses. And that means they can be unlearned. It's a process and it takes time, but it is possible. So I'm going to present you all with some steps, and these are some things to think about and work through. First, we need to identify where the shame's coming from. The first step is letting go of that shame, is understanding exactly where it came from in the first place. We need to ask ourselves some tough questions here. Whose voice is telling me that my desires are wrong? Is it society, a partner, my upbringing, my religious or cultural beliefs? And do I actually agree with that message, or have I just absorbed it over time? Now, once you pinpoint the source, it becomes easier to separate your thoughts from the ones that were planted in you. A lot of shame doesn't actually belong to us, it's inherited. It's something that we're taught, not just something we choose. And recognizing that is a huge step forward to letting it all go. So the next part of this is we've got to challenge those beliefs. And once you've identified the source, it's time to start questioning it. Is this belief actually true? Who benefits from me believing this? And who would I judge someone else if the way I'm judging myself? Most of the time when we examine these ideas, we realize that they don't hold up. We realize that we've been carrying around someone else's fears, their limitations, and mistakes, all of those things for facts. None of that, though, is true. One of the most powerful ways to challenge these beliefs is through education and exposure. Read, learn, go to classes, listen. Seek out others who share your interests. When you realize just how many people have the exact same desires, the shame starts to lose its grip. When you start to see that your kink or your fetish isn't some isolated secret that you should be ashamed of, and that it's just another part of human sexuality, you start to feel a little bit more free. The next part, you need to find supportive people and places to explore what you're into. Because, like I said to you, shame thrives in isolation, but connection can dismantle it. Finding a supportive community, whether it's, somewhat online or definitely in person, can be life changing. Join kink positive forums, groups, social spaces. Listen to other people's experiences and share your own when you're ready. And surround yourself with people who don't just tolerate you, but genuinely accept you. And not everyone in your life is going to understand, but that's okay. They don't need to. The goal isn't to get approval from everyone else. It's just to find enough people who truly see and accept you for who you are, because that's all you need. The next part, all of this, you got to navigate your, relationships and communications. So if you are in a relationship where your partner is struggling to accept your fetish, first you got to talk. Communication's key. It's not about forcing them to be involved. It's about helping them to understand that this is part of you. It doesn't replace the relationship. It doesn't diminish what you bring as a partner. And it certainly doesn't make you any less loving or committed. Approach these conversations with honesty and patience. Give your partner space to ask questions, and if they're open to learning, provide them with resources. Some people need to unlearn their own misconceptions about kink and fetishism. But here's the real hard truth. Sometimes no matter how much explaining you do, a partner might not be able to accept it. And if that's the case, then you have to ask yourself, can I be in a relationship where a core part of who I am isn't accepted? But there's nothing wrong with them for not accepting it either. We have to see that both ways. But no matter what, that question, it's not easy, but it's an important one. Because at the end of the day, repressing yourself to keep someone else comfortable isn't love, it's self-sacrifice. And you deserve better than that. Finally here, you have to own your desires without an apology. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't just to reduce the shame. It's to replace that with confidence. To remove the hiding part of who you are, to owning it fully. You don't need anybody's permission to enjoy what you enjoy. You don't need to justify why something turns you on. If it's consensual and it brings you fulfillment, then it's yours. And guess what? That's enough. This is where the real self-acceptance begins. Not with waiting for the world to say, guess what? It's okay. Celebrate it. But with you deciding that you no longer need the world's approval in the first place. And when you get to that point, that's when shame finally loses its complete hold and grip on you. Look, so much of shame and guilt comes from the messages we didn't choose. Once we, especially the ones we absorbed from society or our family, our partners, how we were brought up. But the reality is, we don't have to keep carrying these things. Our desires, our kinks, our fetishes, these are just parts of who we are. And they're no different from any other human longing for connection, for excitement, for fulfillment. These aren't flaws. They don't make you broken. And the moment we stop seeing them that way is the moment we start reclaiming ourselves. The work on shame, of shedding shame, isn't easy, but it's definitely worth it. And as you move forward, I want to leave you with something to think about. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, become who you are. And at the end of the day, self-acceptance isn't about getting validation from somebody else. It's about standing in who you are, fully, unapologetically, and without shame. Right? So ask yourself this. If I stopped apologizing for who I am, what would my life look like? Because maybe, just maybe, the only thing standing between you and that life is the decision to finally let go of the shame that was never yours to carry in the first place. I know this is a big topic, and it has been revolving with things I've been reading around to, recent days, a few people I've been working with, and it really does permeate a lot of the things we do. So I really want to keep this discussion going online. So I want to see some comments from you all. whether it's on Spotify or on Fetlife, all of that will be linked for you. Talk about these things, because every one of us, I don't know anybody who hasn't overcome this in some form. So let me know your thoughts and your comments below. Now, in the coming weeks, I'm going to be having a conversation with somebody. I'm going to let you all know now that is going to bring their personal experience of a very difficult childhood, coming up with a lot of trauma, and how they found kink and the psychological impact. Literally, I wrestled with the idea when I first thought about it, but this is what the show is. This is literally what I want to talk about here, the way that BDSM transformed someone's life. So that discussion is coming, maybe next week or the next couple. Also coming up, I've got something I want to do. When I talked about the exploitation of those in a lifestyle, I am talking about people who sell you classes or create 30 classes for the same topic that are appealing to different groups, so we keep division alive, or they're going to build your profile, on a place that's not a dating site so you can make better connections. For what? And you're spending hundreds or thousands of dollars, and they're preying on your vulnerability, on your naivety. Don't do that. We're going to talk about that in the coming weeks as well. So let me know what you think about all of this going on, what your thoughts are on shame and guilt, maybe your own experiences. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay tuned.